Now, changes in no-till. Because we're changing the environment in which we are growing these crops, now we can distinctly see shifts in the types of insects. Actually, when we look at it, we'll see that some insects are going to be increased in population, so we would consider that a negative impact on our cropping system. Some insects may be reduced in population, so that would be a positive in our cropping system. And then some of them won't really be impacted one way or the other. They're just going to be what they are going to be, partially because of the environment in which they may be developing, or they may be coming from outside of the field into the field once the crop is growing. So they don't really care what the environment is that crop is, either conventional tillage or no-till. So starting out the process here, you can see that this corn seed has an insect hanging on the outside of it here. And some of the seeds, when they're broken open, they're soft. Parts of it have turned dark colors, and there is an insect inside of it. And this particular insect happens to be the seed corn maggot. And the seed corn maggot can be increased in its prevalence in a no-till situation, and we'll come back to why that is. But the first question is, what is a maggot? You know, what is it in relationship to a type of insect? You know, what is it? It's a fly. And it's a specific stage of the fly. It is the larval stage. And of course, that larva has no way of getting itself there under its own power. So where do they come from? You know, if it's a larval stage of a fly, of course, naturally, it's the adult fly that's flying into that scenario. And when that adult fly gets there, it's going to lay eggs into that environment. And when those eggs hatch, they hatch out into the larva, and it's going to search for some food source. And in typical conventional tillage, about the only time that we really worried about having seed corn maggot was if there had been a large amount of green material that was turned into the soil, or manure that was turned into the soil just prior to planting. And so what occurred then is that green material or that manure would begin decomposing, and it gave off odors. And that's what drew the adult fly into that field in the first place. It was the odors that were being given off from the manure or from the decomposing green material. In a no-till situation, there could be lots of material laying on the surface of the soil that is decomposing, that would attract the adult flies into the area, and then they would lay their eggs on the soil surface. And of course, the next thing that they could potentially be going to would be the seed that's in the seed furrow. And that's the adult fly there. Nothing very distinct about it. A little smaller than a housefly, and if you saw it flying around a field, you wouldn't really be able to distinguish that from any other fly that was there until, of course, you had a problem with your stand being missing, and then you would start investigating, looking as to why your stand was reduced. It can also impact soybeans just as much as it impacts seed corn. So it's the same insect, even though it's called the seed corn maggot. It doesn't really care what germinating seed may be present there in the field. There's nutrition there, and it could attack it. As well as, if the cotyledon isn't necessarily available to be eaten, the seed maggots will also attack the growing seedling. So they can burrow into the stem of either corn or soybean and damage the growing point or kill the seedling before it got to grow any further than just the early stages of emergence. So you can see seed maggot at the base of that corn seedling. The corn seed has already been consumed entirely. Now there's some pupal stages there. Now the epicotyle of the soybean plant here has been totally riddled by the presence of the seed maggot, and neither one of these is going to survive, or if it does survive, it's going to be very unthrifty and not be very productive. So The potential for seed corn maggot in no-till can be a problem. It can be an increased problem greater than what we would see in conventional tillage. So what is the condition that could favor the seed corn maggot in no-till that may not be present as readily in conventional till? You know, what's the conditions? What are the environmental conditions that would endanger those seedlings? Well, not necessarily the weeds, but cover on the soil. And if you cover the soil with residue or weed material and other things, how is that soil going to be slower in responding to the environment? Typically, that no-till is going to stay colder and wetter than a conventional tillage situation. So that should be kept in mind as one of the potential methods that we can manage this type of insect. Along with the seed corn maggot, there is also the seed corn beetle. Two different insects, but both of them can be associated with no-till. Now, this is a little carabid beetle or a ground beetle, and we'll hear that term a little later again. But compared to the pencil point, that's all the bigger that insect is. So it's not very large. And again, you're probably not going to easily see that until you start investigating why you may be missing corn plants in your stand. And when you dig up some of those corn seeds, you may discover that a little beetle inside of the embryo area where it has totally consumed the embryo. And again, it's these cold, wet conditions that can slow down the emergence of that seed. That seed may lay there for longer periods of time, and it can become soft. It can begin giving off odors that would be attractive to these types of insects that come in there. So those are a couple of things that can attack the seed while it's sitting there in the cold, wet conditions. The other insect that occasionally becomes problematic is the wireworm. And the wireworm is this larva of a beetle here on the right-hand side. It's described so because when you dig it out of the soil and discover it, you roll it between your finger and thumb, and it's going to feel like a chunk of wire. It's going to have a very hard characteristic to the body of that insect. The adults of the wireworm are called click beetles, otherwise known as the Elateridae. In the click beetles, there's a whole slew of different species out there. They are grass feeders as adult insects. So they're going to be highly attracted to areas where there's a fair amount of grass material for the beetle to consume. And once they're there, they mate, they drop to the soil surface, and will begin laying their eggs in that area. And so in grass crops such as corn, or especially following sod that had been growing over the soil, like a pasture that's being converted back to crop production, or an area that's had lots of problems with grassy weeds, like the foxtails and some of the panicums and other perennial grasses that can become a problem in no-till scenarios, can be attractive to these adult beetles, and they can lay their eggs in the soil and generate the wireworms. Now, the other problem with the wireworm as a larva is it can take 2 to several years for that larva to complete its development. So even after the field that was a pasture is converted to crop production, these larvae may linger in that soil for 2, 3, sometimes 4 years after that initial conversion back into crop production. They not only can damage the seed directly, so you can see some of the wireworms here chewing their way through the seed after it has germinated. They can also chew straight through the base of the seedling. And a young corn seedling, of course, its growing point is still well below the soil surface. And so when they go through the middle of that seedling, they hit that growing point, and once you destroy the growing point, that seedling is done. So that also can lead to stand reduction, especially in a cornfield. Management of these early season types of pests that can damage either the seed or the seedling directly can include delaying planting. And for no-till, that's not really that bad of an idea. When you see your neighbors out there that are conventionally tilling and beginning to plant into that disturbed soil, and that soil is firm enough to support their equipment, you probably ought to wait a week to 2 weeks later before you start planting, because your soil temperatures are going to be much lower than those conventionally tilled soils. And if you get in there too early, those seeds won't germinate nearly as rapidly, and when they do germinate, they're going to grow much more slowly than those conventionally tilled types of fields. So that's going to keep that seed laying there in the soil for a much longer period of time, and a lot of bad things can occur to it during that period. The other potential to manage these types of insects are the seed treatments that include the neonicotinoids. And of course, if you listened to the presentation that would have occurred yesterday afternoon, you may have heard a lot of bad things about neonicotinoids. That's still debatable. The jury is really still out for most people, except for some extreme groups. The neonicotinoids are very effective, especially against the seed maggots. And if you're in a situation where you're fairly confident that you're going to have potential problems with the seed maggots or wireworms, it is a very effective material against those types of insects. That's not to say that every no-till field is going to have a problem, and they don't necessarily all have to have that seed treatment, but when you do, it is very effective. The other thing, we heard a bit about this earlier today, are slug problems. And no-till plus no-till covered with a cover crop, this can become a very prevalent problem. Slugs can damage any kind of seedling that's growing in that kind of scenario. Soybeans are just as easily damaged as corn plants are. They have fairly a unique type of feeding style when it comes to feeding on these seedlings. They have in their mouths what is called a radula. And if you look at that underneath a magnifying glass or underneath a microscope, it looks like a rasping file. And they use that rasping tongue to scrape plant tissue away, giving this kind of appearance in soybeans and this kind of appearance in the corn seedlings. Now, once again, this is going to be highly favored by the cool, moist conditions that can be associated with cover crop plus no-till and a slow growth of seedlings. The slower seedlings are growing in those scenarios, the more easily they can be highly damaged by slugs. Now, slugs aren't necessarily limited to no-till situations. I've been in conventional fields in the middle of summer running traps for other insects that I study, and I found multitudes of slugs on my traps. So they're climbing from the soil surface all the way up to the ear area of corn plants, even in the middle of the summer. If there's enough moisture around, they can survive and thrive in that type of situation. Sometimes we think those slugs are massive out there in the field, when in fact they are the smaller slugs that cause most of the problems. We have 3 very prevalent species in Ohio, one being the black marsh slug, and they can build to some pretty phenomenal populations in no-till fields. Surprisingly, it's not necessarily the adult slugs that cause all of the injury. It is prevalently juvenile slugs, and you can see the dime there and a multitude of tiny little slugs in the cup there. The importance of recognizing that is adult slugs move around a lot, and so they can travel pretty good distances in a field on a nightly basis. However, the juveniles do not move around nearly as much as the adults do, and they can concentrate their feeding on individual plants for much longer periods of time. So it can concentrate their damage on individual plants and lead to the destruction of those plants much more easily than with the adult slug. We have the gray garden slug, the black marsh slug, and a dusky slug being three of the most common slugs that we encounter in fields in Ohio. And here you can see corn seedlings that have been fed pretty heavily upon. Here, flipped over the leaf and they're still on that. And typically this is going to be early in the morning. If it's an overcast day or a somewhat foggy day where the sun isn't out burning brightly, the slugs will still remain up on the plants. But if you go into a field later in the morning or in the heat of the day during the afternoon, you're not going to find slugs easily. They're going to retreat back down to the soil surface and down into the cracks of that soil. So you may not necessarily see the slugs present like you do here on the soybean plant and the corn plant. Some of the adult slugs, they can be a bit more hardy and may stay out a little bit later than the juvenile slugs. But in any case, they can feed fairly heavily on those earliest leaves of those plants. Management of slugs, and this is a really tough one. Management of slugs is not an easy prospect. There are molluscicides out there. However, they are incredibly expensive, and you really wouldn't want to pay that much money to treat large acreages of field crops. It's cost prohibitive, except for when you get massive populations concentrated in a few spots in a field, and you can spot treat with these materials like deadline bullets or deadline pellets. There's the metaldehyde products and there's the iron phosphate products. So there's a couple of active ingredients out there. We really basically need to hope for warmer temperatures that will speed along the growth of those seedlings so that they can outgrow the feeding damage. Most of those early leaves on either the soybean plant or the corn plant, really their only importance is to get the plant a little bit further beyond in its growth and development. So if we can get those plants growing faster, they can outgrow most of the damage of slugs. Row sweepers or cleaners, they have been certainly toyed with in terms of moving some of the residue away from the seed row, simply to give a zone that can warm up a little faster and dry out a little quicker. There's challenges with row cleaners and sweepers. They can get tangled up in cover crop type of materials and can slow things down tremendously if you end up with that kind of wrapping situation. Biocontrol. There are a number of beetles out there, going back to those ground beetles, that specialize on slugs and snails. And in a no-till scenario, that is a favorable environment for these ground beetles to begin building in population. They will eventually help you with that slug population, but you have to get through that interim of when the slug population gets to a certain size and eventually when the beetle population gets big enough to damage the slug population. Yes?
Is it just ground beetles in general, or are there particular ones to look for?
There are some that specialize just on snails and slugs, but ground beetles in general, they'll eat anything that they can capture. Either they're going to eat the slugs, they're going to eat larvae of other insects, or if they find the eggs, they will consume those as well. So some are just basic generalists, and others are specialists. Yes?
Spraying 28%.
Well, certainly there are other things that can be very caustic toward the slugs. And if you're spraying or applying 28% anyhow as a fertilizer to the field, if you get that side effect of knocking down slug populations, well, that's just a secondary effect of that. Not that we are suggesting that is a control material, because it does not have a label for slugs. But yes, there is some negative effects that occur there against the slug population. Was there another question over here? Yes, Marie.
Are lightning bugs, are they predators of slugs? I've heard that before.
Lightning beetles. Another species of beetle that its larva is a carnivore. It's a predator, and if it's present in that no-till field, it will take advantage of the slug population that is there. Now, the slug isn't entirely defenseless. You know, one of the aspects of a slug is when it's attacked by a predator, it will, basically ooze out slime all over the place. So it's kind of like Slimer from Ghostbusters. And if it gets enough of that slime on a predator, it could bind their mouth parts up long enough for the slug to escape. It's a dog-eat-dog world out there, and there's a lot of generalists that can help with slug populations. It's just, can we get far enough through that slug population? The other thing that's up there, and obviously for no-till, that's a bad word, cultivation. Occasionally there will be a field that is so highly infested that you can't wait for all these other things to take effect, and the only way to solve the problem is to do some sort of aggressive cultivation to knock the population down to start the situation over. Not exactly the best recommendation when it comes to strict no-till. Strict no-till says no tillage, but occasionally there may not be a choice. So we're trying to protect that stand from all these early season types of insects and slugs from reducing the stand counts in different spots of the field. And that's the other thing to remember, is a lot of these things are going to be very spotty. And so if you're not out there scouting the field and looking in all the corners of the field as well as the middle of the field, you could miss the presence of these different early season pests. And you could not discover it until you either did some other activity like a mid-season herbicide application, side dressing, or harvesting before you notice that you truly had a problem in that field. We heard a little bit from Jeff just in the last presentation about chickweed. Chickweed can be a huge mess in no-till situations. And here you can see a no-till corn field, soybean field, and it looks like a green carpet across the entire field. And when you get in closer, you can start seeing the little white flowers of chickweed. And chickweed has a very unique type of flower petal and easily identified when you see it up close. And the primary significance of the presence of chickweed in the field are cutworms. Cutworms, especially black cutworm, is highly attracted to chickweed growing in a field. And whenever we did research on black cutworm on any of our research farms, we picked the worst chickweed covered field that we could find because it was almost a guarantee that we would have black cutworm problems in that field. But black cutworm isn't the only one. This black cutworm is the greasy looking caterpillar up here. We also have the clay-backed cutworm, which is this one, and the dingy cutworm. And both the dingy and the clay-back cutworm, they lay their eggs in the fall, and they overwinter as very tiny young caterpillars. So they've been attracted to the field in the fall and will be waiting there in the springtime for the potential planting of especially corn crops. Black cutworm migrates back into the state every spring, and that's why they're going to hone in on that chickweed population to lay their eggs there. Now, the management of all of these cutworms, especially the black cutworm, if you have a chickweed problem on that field, you want to be in there a couple weeks early to burn that off of the field so that you starve the black cutworms before you plant your corn crop in there. You need to get that burnt off, dried out, and browned out, and wait for a couple of weeks before you plant into that field so that the black cutworms have starved to death and died. Otherwise, you can have some serious damage to your corn crop. Insecticide treatment of that weed and then burn it down with an herbicide even better assures that they will be killed. Scouting, seeing if you have problems after your corn emergence. Rescue treatments are dubious. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. And when it comes to our traded hybrids have very limited impact on black cutworms, so that's not a saving grace either. Common armyworm can be a major problem when you're using cover crops, especially cereal rye. Cereal rye is again a beacon for come hither and lay your eggs in this. and can become a real problem to any kind of corn crop that's planted into that cover crop. This is the type of injury that you can get on that early season plant, which can extend fairly far into the growing season. And I've seen corn plants that are close to 3.5 feet tall that have been totally wiped out by armyworm. An armyworm can extend fairly far into the month of June before it's completely done with its growth and development. And you can see that this was a no-till situation with a cover crop underneath there. It was not treated with an insecticide prior to planting the corn, and it's decimated almost the entire field. So there are situations where it can become quite significant. Management, again, if you have a cover crop of cereal rye that you're going to plant corn into, either get that killed off very early in the spring before the crop is planted, or if it's just shortly before you plant that corn into the field, you're going to have to treat it with an insecticide to assure that armyworm is not a problem. After the fact, you can scout and use a rescue treatment if you find enough injury from armyworm occurring on those plants. Fortunately, it is an easy one to manage with a rescue treatment if you scout, discover it, and react to it in a proper time. European corn borer. For the most part, European corn borer isn't considered much of a problem. However, as some people convert back to conventional corn, it is becoming a problem once again. For a long time, people kind of thought, oh, European corn borer, no problem, haven't seen it for years. But when that conventional corn is brought back into the scene over the past couple of years, I've seen an increase in European corn borer injury. And here you can see the effects of European corn borer being present. It can cause breakage on the stems, and as long as this is above the ear, who cares? But when it starts occurring below the ear or in the ear shank, it can result in a fairly high amount of loss in that field. Here you can see the types of tunneling from the second generation of that European corn borer. Ear shank damage resulting in ear droppage in a field. And this was a field just 2 years ago in Van Wert County. And you can see that I can see pretty much clear across that 80-acre field from one side to the other. And I could almost count the number of plants that were still standing upright as a result of European corn borer. And every plant that I looked into, there was an easily found caterpillar in the stalk, lots of damage to the stalk. Here you can see a field right beside this one where everything's broken off. Turns out this was actually popcorn. That's field corn that was traded. The traded gene still works very effectively against European corn borer. But those corn borers overwinter in residue. And in a no-till situation, that residue is going to lay on the surface of the ground for a number of years. And so there's lots of survival of the caterpillars from one year to the next. Treatment, again, the BT-traded hybrids still work very effectively. If you don't use them, you're going to have to scout and use an insecticide rescue treatment to manage them when the populations get too high. Positive side, now things that do increase in these fields include our beneficial insects, and these are the ground beetles, and this is one of those types of ground beetle that would eat the slugs in a field. But there are a multitude of different types of ground beetles out there, and they are all predators, so other than the seedcorn beetle. Lady beetles also will be highly attracted into a less disturbed system, and they too can build up in populations. And we have the cornfield lady beetle, the convergent lady beetle, the multicolored Asian lady beetle. Now these can all be favored by no-till situations. There are other things out there like Syrphid flies. Now the adult Syrphid fly really doesn't have any major impact by itself. It's the larvae of the Syrphid fly. They are a dry maggot that lives on leaf surfaces that attacks aphids. So you can see this Syrphid fly here, it's just clearing out that aphid population, and they're scrambling as fast as they can to get away from that predator. And then there's all kinds of predaceous bugs out there, and these are true bugs. And things like the wheel bug and the assassin bug, both as an adult and immature nymphs, are major predators of insects. And all of these can be highly favored by a less disturbed environment. And even the spiders. Multitudes of spiders out there, such as the black and yellow garden spider, wolf spiders. These too will start increasing in populations in no-till fields. Ground predators like centipedes and even predaceous mites will become much more common in no-till situations. So these are positive insect and insect relatives that will increase. And then finally, parasitic wasps. These are tiny little wasps that most people never see because they are so small, but they can attack aphid populations. They can even be parasitic on eggs of other insects. These too will be favored in less disturbed environments. And then lastly, these insects really don't care which way it is, whether it's conventional or no-till. Things like the corn flea beetle, corn rootworm, bean leaf beetle, spider mites, aphids, stink bugs, Japanese beetle, grasshoppers. Yeah, they're there no matter what kind of tillage system that you're going to use. They're not going to be favored. They're not going to be disfavored. They're kind of neutral in terms of the impact on their populations, but they're still going to be there.